While the world economy collapses and the U.S. cracks down on civil rights protesters all across the United States, American occupation soldiers were being targeted inside Syria. The Syrian news agency Sana reported that a joint convoy of U.S. forces and Kurdish SDF, known as Qasad in Arabic, was attacked by unknown assailants with machine guns and RPGs in the Rwaished village junction on the administrative boundary between the Syrian governorates of Hasaka and Deir Ezzor. The 8 injured were taken to the headquarters of the American base in the city of Shaddadi, south of Hasaka. Yep, that's an illegal American military base inside Syria. This was not the first incident of its kind. An American officer and 2 SDF fighters were killed on the 27th of last month with an ambush carried out by similar unknown assailants against a patrol of American soldiers at the village of Wasaya in Deir Ezzor countryside. Separately, Sana reported that the U.S. forces brought in military and logistic supplies from Iraq into Syria last week, including Patriot air defense systems, which could become the spark that ignites the area. The U.S.-led coalition denied the media reports about transferring their Patriot air defense systems to Syria, claiming they transported additional equipment and towers for mobile communications to their bases in Hasaka Governorate. It's worth noting that the United States controls several bases in northeastern and eastern Syria, particularly in areas controlled by the SDF. The Syrian government has for long accused Washington of violating the Syrian sovereignty, urging the international community to pressure the United States to withdraw its troops from Syria. Welcome to the Mideastream. I'm Marwa Osman. Local sources in Syria report that a joint convoy for the U.S. forces and the US-backed SDF group was attacked by unidentified gunmen with machine guns and RPG launchers at the roundabout of Rwaished village in the administrative borders between the provinces of Hasaka and Deir Ezzor. To discuss this issue with us from Beirut is Laith Marouf, who's a political commentator. Thank you very much for being with us, Laith. It's nice to see you again. Now, the reported incident comes just 1 month after a similar ambush which led to the actual killing of 1 U.S. Soldier and other Syrian Democratic Forces militias. We're talking about an area that's predominantly held by the Kurdish forces, who is being maybe the allies of the U.S. in the region, despite the fact that the U.S. left them. The famous saying of it dropped them like a hot potato when they needed them. But do you think that these string of events are really unrelated?
They are definitely related. We heard the Syrian president and the Syrian army speak about the resistance that will happen against the American occupation. We also heard Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, speaking about the upcoming resistance that is to be expected against the American occupation. And these incidents are just the opening shots in this. The Syrian army probably will not want to directly confront the American army, and that's something also, again, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah referred to last week in his interview with Al-Noor radio station. And most probably there will be a native indigenous resistance movement in Hasaka, in Deir Ezzor, and in Raqqa against the American occupation. But these incidents will start becoming more significant and more more close to each other as the Syrian government clears the remaining areas in the northwest, in Idlib and Aleppo, from the Wahhabi Contras. And then the concentration will come to deal with the treasonous Kurdish Contras and the American occupation in northeast Syria.
Well, Laith, the alleged attack is said to have been carried out by unidentified assailants, armed gunmen with automatic weapons, with RPG launchers, and it has injured U.S. troops, so it's pretty serious. and they have been taken to the military base in Hasaka, to the US occupation military base, for treatment. But correct me if I'm wrong here. This really sounds like South Lebanon, early 90s, when the Islamic resistance in Lebanon was beginning to fight against the Israeli occupation in South Lebanon. This is how they operated. What do you think about that?
For sure. I mean, there is a coalition between Hezbollah, the Syrian government, the Syrian army, and the experiences and expertise that is there is being transferred. And as we speak right now, we know that there is the defense forces that are local, Syrian population that is being trained. You have the Palestinian factions also around Deir Ezzor. So we can see and expect what is to come. We have to look at the long term, obviously. This intensity of this resistance is not going to happen very fast. As very logically, Idlib is the priority. But we shouldn't be surprised if things escalate faster than we expect.
Well, in the past 2 months, incidents between the Syrian army units and the local villages on one side and the U.S. occupation on the other side was actually escalating. We saw a lot of standoffs between the locals and the U.S. occupation forces, especially when they were trying to take local roads. People just went out of their houses, out of their businesses, and started throwing stones at the armed vehicles of the U.S. occupation army. This is by all means an occupation. This is how we should be referring to it. But where does the international community, and namely the UN here, stand from this?
The United Nations is crippled. It is, everything depends on the Security Council taking decisions, and the Security Council is held hostage by the United States and its veto, and is held hostage literally in New York, where many of the representatives of other countries are having problems arriving, as we saw in the last few months with Venezuela and others. And so when we talk about resistance to occupation from the United States and its allies, the only way you can resist that is by directly fighting it. There's no need to think about the international community, because when we talk about the international community, what we really mean is the Western societies that are, part of the American empire. The civilians in northeast Syria are proud peoples. They are standing against the occupation whenever they can. And unfortunately, the latest incident a few weeks ago, when the civilians stood in front of the American occupation forces and forced them to go back off their road. A few days later, the treasonous Kurdish Contras rounded up many of those people, many of those civilians that are were in the video, and disappeared them. This is not going to continue for too long, and people will be held responsible for their treasonous actions and working up with the American occupation.
Something very interesting happened a week ago in specific. We started hearing about reports and reading about reports coming whether from Sana news agency or other Iraqi news agencies and Iraqi satellite television, talking about how the U.S. occupation is moving the Patriot missiles, the Patriot defense, air defense missiles from Iraq into Syrian territory, specifically in Deir Ezzor. We saw a couple of reports about that. They are being taken towards near the oil fields of Deir Ezzor. Obviously, the U.S. coalition, by the spokesperson, denied these reports and said that they were fake news. But what do you think is actually happening here?
The United States is very worried about its hold on the oil fields in northeast of Syria, but also, they can see that Russia just delivered new MiG fighters to the Syrian Air Force. They can see that their presence in Iraq is very fragile. Things could escalate very fast there. That's why they probably brought in these air defenses. But even if they didn't bring any Patriot missiles into northeast Syria, it is most probably that the resistance will come from the ground. It's not going to come from the air. As happened in South Lebanon, there will be skirmishes directly on the ground there will be skirmishes on the ground and not from the air. I don't think the Syrian government is going to use its air force to bomb the American army. That will open a can of worms. So the direct civilian militia resistance will be the path that most likely will be taken.
Specifically, that we're talking about eastern Syria and northeastern Syria here, and if such a move is taken by the U.S. coalition, it means that Turkey might be trying to also take another certain moves because they might see it as a threat coming from allies of the YPG. What do you think?
Turkey is just beholden by the United States. It may look like that they have a fight with the United States over what to do in Syria, but they are part of NATO, and that means that the final orders come from Washington. And again, the Kurdish militias, the Kurdish Contras, are now funded by Saudi Arabia. They're protected by the United States. So all these actors play out some roles that are determined to them by the empire, and they play this drama to look like that they are fighting each other, but in the end they will follow the orders that come from Washington. So maybe the empire's hold on these actors is weakening, as we see the empire right now crumbling its power within inside the United States, even with all the rebellion that is happening there. And so there will be some maybe maneuverability for these house slaves, whether Kurdish or Turkish, but in the end they will have to choose: are they going to be protected by the empire or go it alone against Syria and Russia? And none of those actors would want to go.
It definitely seems to remain to be seen. I want to thank you very much, Laith Marouf, who's political commentator, for joining us from Beirut. And please now stay tuned for our second segment. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, has warned its actives in Yemen that there's a near potential breaking point as the new coronavirus is spreading throughout the impoverished country, where the healthcare system has effectively collapsed amid a bloody Saudi-led war. Yemeni health sector near potential breaking point in this following report. The World Food Programme warned last week that humanitarian aid projects to war-torn Yemen are reaching breaking point, and some $870 million is needed to continue giving life-saving assistance to millions of vulnerable people for the next 6 months. The appeal for a fresh cash injection comes after more than 5 years of Saudi-led aggression against the Arabian Peninsula country. According to the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, around 80% of the Yemeni population needs humanitarian assistance. At a press conference held remotely, Elizabeth Byers, World Food Programme senior spokesperson, noted the agency's particular concern for over 20 million Yemenis who are food insecure, of which nearly 10 million are acutely food insecure. World Food Programme expects coronavirus to push many more children in Yemen into acute malnutrition. Over 2 million children in Yemen are already acutely malnourished, and it's a figure that the World Food Programme fears will increase. It is also widely feared that with around half of the country's health facilities shut, Yemen lacks the means to prevent the latest COVID-19 threat to an already weakened population that faces the ever-present threat of cholera and ongoing conflict that has displaced more than 4 million people. Aid workers report having to turn people away because they do not have enough medical oxygen or sufficient supplies of personal protective equipment. UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, echoed concerns that the aid situation in Yemen threatens to spin out of control, describing it as the world's worst humanitarian crisis with unparalleled protection concerns. Separately, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs (OCHA) said on Tuesday that it had received around 15% of the funding required for the $3.38 billion 22 humanitarian response plan for Yemen. At least 80% of the 28 million strong population is also reliant on aid to survive in what the United Nations has called the world's worst humanitarian crisis. On May 22, the UN rang alarm bells that Yemen's health system has in effect collapsed as a result of the Saudi-led military campaign and tight naval and air blockade imposed on the country. And to discuss this issue with us from London is Shabir Hassanali, who's a political commentator. Thank you very much for being with us, Mr. Shabir. Now, the United Nations says that Yemen's health system has effectively collapsed under the strain of the COVID-19, and the international aid group Médecins Sans Frontières, which is Doctors Without Borders, said that dozens of people with coronavirus symptoms are dying at home in the city of Aden. I am personally tired of the UN's cheap talk and never acting. When is this going to change?
Thank you for having me. I think when is the UN going to change? When it has credible people and honorable people running it, and when the veto power is removed from entities like the US and the UK. Until then, the UN is nothing. It's a joke. It's achieved nothing, none of its objectives ever. And all it's done is facilitate. Like in terms of Yemen, for example, the UN facilitates the embargo. It talks about COVID-19 right now, but what about the cholera epidemic, the typhoid epidemic, diphtheria? All of these illnesses that have been wiped out across the rest of the world suddenly are reappearing in Yemen. And of course, in Yemen, the Saudis are the ones that are committing the crimes directly, but America is the one behind it. And the UN is run and controlled by America. I mean, Trump makes all of these noises. Maybe he should turn around and say he'll leave the UN, because maybe at that point, when the US is no longer a member of the UN might actually do something useful. It should take the UK with it as well, though.
Well, I do agree with you, but we have heard a report from the World Food Programme, which they declared last month that it will stop aid to Sana'a. This is what they said, because of certain political reasons. That's what their pretext is. But they are warning that some $870 million there is needed to continue giving life-saving assistance to millions of vulnerable people in this impoverished country. I don't know where they're giving, we're not seeing, but they do have a Saudi representative at the World Food Programme. Why don't they just ask the Saudis, first of all, to lift that blockade and then pay reparations for the disasters that they have caused for this impoverished Arab country?
They should. The World Food Programme, again, it should ask and in fact even sanction the Saudis and tell them, look, you either pay or you are no longer part of this program. And this idea that they're going to stop aid to Sana'a and to Yemen, the World Food Programme is supposed to be a humanitarian organization. When there's people starving because of the direct actions of members of the World Food Programme, for the World Food Programme to then turn around and say, we're not going to help anymore, this is unforgivable, and this will live in history as, one of the many reasons why groups like the World Food Programme, the UN, World Health Organization, others that have failed in their responsibilities to the planet and to the people, these organizations will become relics in museums of a time when humanity lost its mind. The reality is they need to not just talk to their Saudi representative, and they do have Saudi representatives, of course. They need to not just tell them that, look, you need to pay this money, but they need to tell them, look, you either pay or you leave. You are no longer contributing usefully to this thing. You're creating a situation where we have to help a people. You need to leave. Because if the Saudis were not blockading Yemen, then Yemen doesn't need to beg anyone for food. Yemen is perfectly capable, and it has many friends across the world who would be more than happy. I know personally right now of many charities that want to send money. They've got close to millions
But
of
they
dollars
can't because of the blockade.
They can't get the money in. The money is just sitting there. They can't get the money in.
Well,
they don't
the
trust
numbers,
people like,
Shabir, are just horrifying. We have over 20 million Yemenis who are food insecure, and of which nearly 10 million are acutely food insecure. That could easily be resolved, just as you said, by lifting the air blockade, the land blockade, the naval blockade, and by just allowing the Yemenis to breathe in order for them to start trade again and eliminate all these factors that are contributing to this disastrous health situation. The Saudis have failed to give just one logical reason and explanation of why they are keeping this blockade on Yemen. Basically, it's paralyzed. What do you think can be done to try and change the status quo?
I think, again, because of the world order that we live in, the only way you're going to get a real change is if America is taken out of the equation and the rest of the world develops a conscience, develops some decency, and forces the Saudis, and in fact breaks the blockade. The same way Iran recently broke the blockade with Venezuela, there should be a move to break the blockade. I mean, I was working with some people who were involved in attempting to break the blockade on Gaza, and they are looking at breaking the blockade on Yemen. But these are small organizations that can't really do a great deal. Where you need large countries, you need large international organizations to actually just render this blockade irrelevant. Because, I mean, the Saudis, you say the Saudis haven't given one logical reason for the blockade. They haven't given one logical reason for the war. The whole war is like an ego trip for MBS, and it's failing catastrophically. And he knows that if he leaves, that's it, it's over. But what he doesn't understand is even him staying, he's over. He's finished. He has nothing. He's one of these lame duck type of kings, if you like. Even if his father might be alive and maybe, remembers what he suggested.
Saudi Arabia, which you are now mentioning, aided and abetted obviously by the US and the UK in the weapons and the training, intelligence, etc. That they have pulverized Yemen's physical and social infrastructure, including the destruction or the closure of more than half of the country's healthcare facilities. And we're talking about a global pandemic here where people cannot find a hospital or a public health facility or institution to try and find help there, along with the water and sanitation problem as well. But it is alarming to see that the people who once stood, the voices, the activists who stood by Yemen, they are now being silenced and they are turning away at a very vital moment because of the pandemic. Whether it's a hoax, it's not a hoax, you believe in it or not, you just left Yemen by itself. Where does this put Yemen on the level of the activism?
Unfortunately, this is actually a very sad reality that I myself have experienced. What you say, I know there are some people who think, like you said, that COVID-19 might be a hoax. Okay, fine, let it be a hoax. Doesn't matter. The main problem in Yemen is the blockade and multiple illnesses, of which COVID-19 is but one. It's the most virulent one. It's the one that's spreading like wildfire. But cholera, typhoid, diphtheria, all of these illnesses that are eradicated in the rest of the world are massively resurgent in Yemen. And this is a problem. And any of these activists who are sort of moving away, these are the fair weather friends, unfortunately, the ones that, they did the same thing in Syria. When Syria needed people most, it was only very, very few people that stood with Syria and the Syrian people. And unfortunately, we're seeing a rerun of this happening in Yemen. And this actual point is actually very painful to me because there are some people I know, they're good people. I thought they were good people, but they've changed.
It is truly heartbreaking to see this manifest into something that takes away and silences the voices of the activists whom we need, especially in states like the United States of America or the UK. But I want to thank you very much, Shabir Hassan Ali, political commentator, for joining us from London to talk about the collapsing health sector in Yemen. Thank you very much for being with us, and please stay tuned next week for more from the Mideastream.